What if I told you that all of us Finfluencers have been lying to you about money management this entire time, and that there is no one secret to fixing your money management issues, regardless of the multitude of budgeting systems that you pick up? And the reason for that is because we are unique as human beings. There are 8 billion of us on this planet, and the chances of you meeting someone who has the same physical attributes as you is 0.0001%. That's 1 in 10 million. And focusing on this idea that a budgeting system is going to fix your money management issues without looking at the nuances of you as a person is almost guaranteed to lead to failure. Now, walk with me on this one, okay? I think the fundamental thing that we often forget about personal finances is that personal finances is personal, which means that what works for me is not going to work for you. What works for Alex is not going to work for David. What works for Emma is not going to work for Mandy. There are personal circumstances, nuances that we need to bear in mind when it comes to picking up any kind of budgeting template to implement into our finances. And there are a number of them that I think that we often miss. Now, you may be asking, what are they, Pete? Well, let's go through them one by one. So this first one is pretty straightforward, and it's the fact that to a man, we all earn different amounts of money, right? So for someone who lives in a major city like London, you may earn really, really well, but if your rent, your mortgage, and your cost of living is way higher than someone in, say, Sheffield, then from a financial point of view and from a management point of view, you're in 2 completely different spaces, because someone in Sheffield earning less than someone in London can be better off financially than the person who's earning more on paper. This is all about getting into the weeds of what it means to have financial stability. And trying to take an arbitrary budgeting system and trying to implement that for someone in Sheffield, thinking it's going to work for someone in London, isn't necessarily the case 100% of the time. There is also a cultural aspect to this as well. And if you're from a background where culture is important, or perhaps you come from an African or an Indian or an Asian background, you might understand this. In fact, you will understand this in the fact that sometimes there is a financial responsibility for you to look after your parents, your elders, your family, whoever that might be. Especially if you are in a position where you're in the UK, you're in the Western world, and you have family back home that you have to send money to. This has a huge impact on what you're able to do from a financial management point of view, because those cultural expectations mean that you are making very, very different financial decisions to someone who only has to fend for themselves. And when we get into the practicalities of how this actually impacts people, real conversations about getting on the property ladder and beginning to invest start to come to the front, because those things are more difficult for people who find themselves with this cultural element, this cultural influence or pressure on their finances. Alongside that, you also have to consider that people are at different life stages and life events. The reality is, if you're in your 20s, your 30s, and your 40s, your priorities are very, very different. If you've just had a child, your financial priorities are going to shift. You may have before been very nonchalant about maybe life insurance, for example, right? But now you have a kid, you're really focusing on making sure that if anything happens to you, you can at least give this new member of your family a start to life that perhaps you didn't have. That creates a shift in your mindset when it comes to finances and your money management. If you're in your 40s, you might not necessarily be thinking about getting on the property ladder because you might already be there, but you're probably thinking about, how can I get my money working as hard as possible so that when I do get round to retirement, I'm able to do that comfortably. And last but not least, we also have our own personality traits and our own personal preferences. And this is by far, I would argue, the most important element that a lot of people don't even realize is a concern, or should be a concern, a consideration when you're thinking about money management. Let me just give you an example. We all grew up differently. We all witnessed different things when we were kids. We know that financial habits are locked in the age of 7. And in my book, I talk about how seeing my friend have better dinners than me created a scarcity mindset, which meant that when I started making really good money, I just spent money because, hey, I've never had this thing before. Some of you may have impulse spending issues. Some of you may have spending issues that are tied to emotions. You feel better when you go spending money that you don't necessarily have. And that could be on a credit card overdraft. You don't care as long as you get that emotional satisfaction, that emotional itch is scratched. All of these things are very, very important, and I would argue the most important thing when it comes to money management. This is something that you cannot fix overnight and takes effort to really unearth what are my triggers, what are the things that make me interact with money in the way that I do. And these are the things that I talk about in my book. It's things that I do in my boot camps where we really unearth, because unearthing those things will help you make better financial decisions. And better financial decisions, yes, they are driven by how you manage money. But if you're not able to get to the root cause, your preferences, your personality traits when it comes to money, it's going to be very, very hard to make a long-standing change. The other thing that also leads into this conversation is, people approach money management in different ways. For example, I like to use spreadsheets. Some people would never use a spreadsheet. They would want a tool, an app, for example, to give them the data so they can go and have a look at it. Do you have an analytical mind? Because if you don't, looking at data isn't necessarily going to help you. Are you someone who needs to see visuals and a pie chart, for example? All of these things are very, very important to budgeting. And if you're arbitrarily just taking a budgeting system, well, it's not going to work if you don't address the things that we've spoken about. So if I were to summarize this video, I think the main thing that I want you to take away from this is the fact that there is no secret, there is no magic wand to effective money management. There is no budgeting system that you can arbitrarily take and just implement into your finances that will change your finances overnight. I think you have to play to your strengths. Someone told me a story about Tiger Woods many, many years ago about how his coaches and his trainers approached making him the golf player that he became. They focused on his strengths and at the same time incrementally improved the things that he wasn't great at. But it was by focusing on his strengths that he became the player that he did. And I think that is transferable over to your personal finances. You will know whether you are an analytical person who likes to look at spreadsheets. You know your style of learning, whether you need to see pie charts. You know whether you have an impulse spending problem or whether you spend from a place of emotion. You'll know whether you come from an environment where you have certain cultural responsibilities and cultural pressures. These are all things that you can use to your advantage and turn into a strength. For me, when I started to figure out all of my financial issues and decided to take action on them, I found that using the 50-30-20 made me feel like a failure. So I created the 3-pot system, which ultimately is what I talk about in my book and has helped me transform my finances. You will know what works best for you. Now, if you are in a position where you know that you have spending issues and they're tied to emotions, you really want to unearth those, then I have a few behavioral tests which I'll link in the comment section down below. You can go and take those for free and see what it unearths. And if you do want to speak to me, then drop me a message or drop me an email and I'll be happy to help and have a conversation with you, or maybe perhaps look at some coaching as well. But I'm heading back. I'll catch you in the next one.